Hi guys, I was originally going to make this video as part of the How to Immerse in a Foreign Language series, which you can check out by clicking the card on the screen right now, and you should. I worked really hard on it. But finally I decided putting time boxing into its own video is probably a lot better. And so here we are, let's jump right in. If I'm quite honest with myself, not all the activities of immersion learning are my favorites. For example, I often found myself choosing and watching content to improve my language ability rather than just content that I was interested in. And honestly, to reach higher levels of ability in a language, you will almost certainly have to do the same thing too. But luckily for me, a technique that I found and adopted from the very first day I started learning my first language was time boxing. Now today, I'm only going to be talking about time boxing and its methodology. In the future, if you would like me to make another short video sometime of me demonstrating myself actually doing time boxing, then please leave a comment on this video letting me know that, and I can do that as well. Go ahead and subscribe and leave a like too while you're at it. Anyways, what I found so compelling about time boxing was its ability to help me systematically engage with and complete tasks that require considerable discipline, and tasks that I'm not necessarily very motivated to do. But not only that, time boxing can often be used to dramatically improve one's overall productivity as well. I find that there is actually a certain level of distraction that one has throughout the time they are doing any given activity, and that there's a certain energy cost just to keep your focus on what you're doing. And the number of distractions and the cost paid seem to rise the longer someone has been doing a particular activity. And I believe that time boxing can greatly cut down on the number of distractions you have when you're doing a given task. And I also believe that it's likely through years of time boxing experience that I feel I have honed my ability to be usually highly focused on what I'm currently working on. But what is time boxing? Time boxing is actually a really simple concept. It is simply the process of doing multiple activities in a cyclical manner at a given interval. Personally, I always use 2 activities. I've heard of people using 3 or even more, but when I tried it, I found that I didn't prefer it. Now, besides always using 2 activities, there are actually 2 particular types of time boxing that I have always done. We can call the first type goal leisure time boxing, and we can call the second type goal time boxing, or even double goal time boxing if you prefer. Goal leisure time boxing is the act of switching from an activity related to your goals, for example your SRS flashcard reviews, to a leisure activity that you enjoy that is not related to your goals. For example, playing a video game, watching a YouTube video, even checking Twitter, or sending some messages to your friends on social media. And of course you would do this at a given interval, and later in the video I will go more in depth about the different intervals you can use and my own preferences. In contrast with goal leisure time boxing, goal time boxing is simply the act of switching at a given interval between 2 activities that are both related to your goal. For example, switching between SRS reviews and listening immersion, or even just switching between listening immersion and reading immersion. I actually widely use and still use these time boxing strategies, and oftentimes switch between them many times on the same day. So what are the main benefits of each of these 2 types of time boxing? The main difference that I see between goal leisure and goal time boxing is the amount of effort required to do each of them, which would affect when I would choose to use one method over the other. Goal leisure time boxing is best suited for days where you don't feel particularly motivated or have already studied for a good while, whether that was through goal time boxing or simply by regular study. It was always actually very common for me to switch to goal leisure time boxing after I had already completed my daily goals and wanted to study a bit extra, or if I simply tired out while pursuing my daily goal and just wanted to tone down the intensity of my study. And note, studying here just generally means reading or listening to your target language, or doing SRS flashcard reviews, or even just reading about the grammar of your target language in a book. I'm using the term study here to talk about learning more about your target language in any capacity. So goal time boxing was actually how I would often start out my studies. And I would either continue until I finished my SRS reviews, at which point I would usually switch to just doing full immersion, or I would switch to doing goal leisure time boxing with immersion and another unrelated activity. Sometimes what I would do is also time box content in different languages as well. Watch something in Chinese for a little bit, watch something in Japanese for a little bit, for example. If I tired out doing goal time boxing before I finish my reps, which would happen pretty regularly, then I would almost always switch directly to goal leisure time boxing until my SRS reviews were finished. And also, I just want you to remember that after I finished SRS reviews, I would often just switch to regular immersion as well and not use time boxing for a while. In place of time boxing, I would just use the strategy of changing my level of attention in order to stay with the content. And what I would do is simply switch my level of attention depending on how engaged or tired I was. However, I would also often just time box watching content at different levels of attention as well. For example, I might watch at a low level of attention for 5 minutes and then switch to a high level of attention for 2 minutes. So I hope I'm successfully illustrating to you that time boxing can be used in various ways to help you stay engaged during your language studies. But as I've said in my How to Immerse in a Foreign Language series, time boxing is also a great strategy to alleviate and mitigate the stresses associated with language learning. But why is that? I want to tell you about some things that I noticed while working to improve my productivity over the years. First of all, it seems to take a great deal of energy to stay focused on a given task for a prolonged period of time. But it seems much easier to stay focused on a task the shorter the time period that you will be doing that task. But not only that, when doing a task for a short period of time, it doesn't seem to require nearly as much energy to do. From my perspective, that seems to be because the energy required to continue doing a task rises alongside the duration that you've been doing that task. Let me give a concrete example of what I mean. Say we are doing 55 minutes of goal leisure time boxing with a 5-minute interval. That would amount to 30 minutes of a goal-related activity and 25 minutes of an activity unrelated to your goal. Well, from my experience, the last 5 minutes of doing a goal-oriented activity while time boxing, you are very likely to be considerably more focused during those last 5 minutes and also feel less discomfort and fatigue than you would if you had been doing that activity for 30 minutes straight without pause. This also seems to largely be the case for goal time boxing as well. And this is actually information that surprises a lot of people when I've previously introduced time boxing to them. They usually very quickly understand why goal leisure time boxing might be effective, but they don't really understand why goal time boxing would be helpful as easily. From my perspective, there are two main ways that time boxing seems to work. And I feel that goal time boxing works primarily because of the first way. And the first way that time boxing seems to function is the act of simply changing your focus of attention from one task to another, even if that's another work-related task, seems to serve as a sort of reset to our brain and seems to allow it to operate in a way that might be more natural for it to do so. Namely, it allows the brain to change focus and pay attention to something else at a smaller time interval, which from my experience seems to be far more in line with what my brain actually wants to do. And this simple act of allowing a change in focus and attention at a regular interval seems to greatly impact my motivation towards each task. And at times, it genuinely just feels like a game. The second way I feel that time boxing seems to work is that the act of sort of making a contract with your reptile brain, or as I've referred to it in previous videos, your ape, generally seems to help that part of your brain calm down and let you get some work done. Particularly after you become more practiced in time boxing, you will find that the ape part of your brain can generally become pretty accepting of studying in this way. And this is particularly true for goal leisure time boxing, which I found allowed me to study nearly the entirety of the day when I wanted to, which of course was during my hardcore language learning phases. I genuinely found studying for a bit and then playing games for a bit to be a pretty fun way to spend my day. Of course, your mileage will vary though. But there are definitely some negatives associated with time boxing that you should keep in mind if you're thinking about utilizing it. I think the first major negative of time boxing is that, as I will talk about later, not all activities can be done as effectively using it. But I think that this largely doesn't apply to language learning activities though. Second, there are various practical challenges that time boxing presents. It simply takes longer to complete your daily goals when time boxing. And if you're someone who already has very limited time, say if you only have a couple hours truly to yourself any given day, and you usually use 1 hour of that free time to study your target language, and for the other other hour, you don't really schedule anything and just do what you generally feel like doing, which may be to pursue another hobby you like on some days, or just relax and watch some shows that you like on others. It can be very difficult then to justify merging these two time slots together under this given situation, because then it might likely feel that you have 2 hours of scheduled activities during your free time each day, and that therefore in effect your real free time is completely gone. And this is actually something that I often felt when I tried to reintroduce language learning into my life at unreasonable levels when I was already very busy. Another negative is just that simply time boxing is not going to appeal to everyone either, and it still requires considerable discipline to do. But I do feel that for a lot of people, time boxing can ultimately very substantially reduce the psychological burden that they feel from their language learning. And if you're someone who's been having trouble meeting your daily goals, I sincerely hope that you will at least try time boxing out for a week or two and compare your productivity. You should definitely be wary of just dismissing the usage of time boxing just because certain negatives do exist. After using it just for a short time, it should be relatively easy to gauge how you feel about your studies when using time boxing, and to measure and compare your productivity when you're time boxing with when you're not. I would say that only after you've done this should you make your final decisions about time boxing. I personally found that except for those really motivated days where I didn't want or need to use time boxing, it could still be very productive, oftentimes meeting my daily goals within record times, that overall it was a better strategy for me personally to heavily leverage time boxing. Time boxing not only allowed me to consistently meet my daily goals, even though it took longer to complete them, but it also gave me the ability to do considerably more total work when I chose to. For example, using time boxing, I was able to study 100 kanji a day in my SRS while using the Remembering the Kanji book, which is a book about learning Chinese characters in a sort of increasing complexity, which can greatly simplify the process. I can confidently say that there's absolutely no way I could have done this without time boxing. I would have been way too frustrated if I had tried to complete the study of 100 new kanji, plus hundreds or even at times over 1,000 reviews of the kanji I had already learned in a single sitting, or actually even in 2, 3, 4, or 5 sittings. It would have never happened. There's truly no way I could have ever done it. Actually, I even have an old video about this that you can check out if you're interested. But beware, the videos from before I actually started doing YouTube, so the video and audio quality is a bit shoddy to say the least. But anyways, I do plan to eventually remake that video along with the entirety of my How I Learned Japanese series. And I plan to do it with higher production value so that it may continue to help people well into the future. The last thing I want to say about studying kanji in this way is that I never recommend anyone to do it. And I only did so because of misinformation going around at that time. Again, you can watch my video for the details. Now we'll go into some of the activities that I feel are well suited for time boxing, and also go into the sorts of intervals that I previously played with, and ultimately the sorts of intervals that I found I preferred. I do want to briefly touch on the fact that many activities aren't well suited for time boxing. For example, activities like programming that require a person to have a considerable amount of information loaded into their brain at once are not really well suited for time boxing unless you're using pretty darn long time intervals. But from my experience, if you start using pretty long time intervals, for example 25 or 30 minutes, you will likely end up losing a large part of the productivity and efficiency benefit that time boxing provides. I've tried to incorporate programming with time boxing, and I've gotten it to work with longer intervals, but of course it doesn't quite boost your productivity as it would when using short intervals. But shorter intervals simply do not work for an activity like programming. The relief that you get in being able to take a short break is simply not worth the entry cost of getting back into programming and having to reload everything you were just thinking about. It's simply too taxing and actually causes me to tire out more quickly than if I would have just been programming. The activities that I've found that are best for time boxing are either activities that are easily quantifiable, for example SRS reviews, or even watching a show which you could just watch X minutes of, or a book which you could read X pages of. Also, activities which are of fixed length are also quite good. For example, using video games with well-defined round times that fit pretty well into your time boxing intervals, even if not perfectly. But once you've found activities that generally fit well into time boxing, how do you go about deciding how long you should actually do each activity? Well, before we talk about time boxing intervals, I just want to tell you that the intervals don't actually have to always be based on a time, but can also be based on a quantifiable measure that you can get while doing a certain activity. So let me actually talk about quantifiable time boxing intervals first, and then talk about duration-based time boxing intervals next. Quantifiable time boxing intervals are based on some quantity related to a given activity. For example, I could do 25 reviews in an SRS and then play one round of my favorite short form video game. Or for example, I could do 15 reviews in my SRS and then read a single page of a book. One thing that I used to really like to do was watch 2 minutes of a given show at a high level of attention, meaning that when I'm still new at a language, including the time for lookups and even card creation, it might take me 5 minutes or even a bit more to watch those 2 minutes of that show. If you want to find out more about immersing at different levels of attention, I recommend you check out the listening and reading videos in my How to Immerse in a Foreign Language series. Anyways, the idea is to use a quantity provided by the activity itself, rather than set a specific amount of real-world time to do an activity. Quantifiable intervals actually became by far my favorite way to do time boxing over the years. And probably around 60 to 70% of the time that I do time boxing, I use this methodology. But of course, I don't use it strictly and still make use of duration-based intervals as well. I feel that the main benefit of quantifiable intervals is that one can become highly motivated to quickly finish the more discipline-based activities in their time boxing rotation. For example, say my time boxing task was to do 25 SRS reviews. Well, maybe I would finish those in only 2 or 3 minutes. But I might only finish 25 or 30 cards if I was using a duration-based interval of 5 minutes, for example. But my friend has actually had the opposite experience, that he will work harder if he knows he has limited time. So this is something that's likely preference-based. But anyways, if your preference is like mine, quantifiable intervals can definitely be very encouraging. But they can definitely be more tiring than time-based intervals if you tend to push yourself too hard, and therefore can possibly lead to burnout more quickly, so make sure you're aware of that. Now, when I use duration-based intervals, I tend to use them in 2 ways. Either I use a fixed length interval, for example 5 minutes, and then switch activities no matter what, or I use a minimum goal-based interval, which for example would be having a goal of doing 5 minutes at least, but trying to push past those 5 minutes and only switching the task when the discomfort starts getting pretty noticeable. So let me briefly talk about what I feel are the positives of these 2 methodologies. Let me talk about fixed time intervals first. Well, in my opinion, a fixed time interval is probably the most relaxed form of time boxing there is. I tend to use it when I basically just want to ensure that I stay with an activity and put the time in. And I don't really try to push myself on every time boxing spurt, although of course at times I will. The most important thing when using a fixed time interval is to resist the temptation of staying with an activity when the time is up. Say the timer goes off when you're in the middle of making a card. I say even in that scenario that you go ahead and switch to your other activity, because if you're not careful, it can be very easy to break the time boxing cycle. Your goal when using a fixed time interval, in my opinion, is basically to be zen and go with the flow. Just try to stay with each activity according to the timer. I'm speaking from experience here. I've found that treating the timer as God when using fixed time intervals is the most effective method of execution. Now let's talk about minimum goal intervals. Minimum goal intervals are, in my experience, much more dangerous for inexperienced time boxers, because it can be very easy to just kind of get lost in the process. When using minimum goal intervals, I think that one should always be doing goal leisure time boxing, and I rarely ever used goal time boxing with this interval type. A very important part of using minimum goal intervals when doing goal leisure time boxing is that the minimum goal should only apply to the goal-related activity, and the leisure activity should be on a fixed time interval instead. Why I think minimum goal intervals can be so challenging is that a lot of people seem to be unaware of when they should go ahead and switch to their leisure activity. It can be tempting to think that you should push as much as possible when doing your goal-related activity, but this is actually not the case. You should really try to be aware of when you start feeling frustrated after you've completed the minimum time. Then you should probably just go for a little bit more than that, even just 30 seconds longer than when you first started feeling frustrated, and then go ahead and switch back to your leisure activity. If you push it too much, you're going to burn out. The whole point of time boxing is to maintain your mood while avoiding burnout. The vast majority of discipline-based activities that I've done over the past 10 years have been under some form of time boxing. Although much less so nowadays, because I've kind of hit a pretty acceptable level of productivity to myself that really doesn't require time boxing in such a rigid sense. But even nowadays, I still do use it regularly. And recently, Migaku actually just reached 500 patrons, and the community voted that I should start improving my Japanese and acquiring pitch accent. So I definitely plan to use time boxing pretty heavily during that pursuit. That project should be starting in January sometime because I want to at least fully focus on development at least until the end of the year. Lastly, I just want to say that I'm pretty experienced with time boxing, and I would suggest to be very conservative when applying its principles. There's no need to push yourself too much. The time boxing principles themselves will pretty much ensure that you are productive if you simply follow them. Okay, to very briefly cover how I like to personally use time boxing, I just want to say that my time boxing preferences have actually changed substantially over the time I've used it. I was much more rigid at first, but now I basically apply the principles freely when studying, and I will often adjust intervals mid-study to better suit my current mood. I feel that doing this likely requires substantial experience with time boxing, so I would recommend that you follow a more rigid approach until you get the hang of it. Over time, you'll actually become better aware of what time boxing is doing for you. So even if you currently intellectually understand that time boxing is basically just a way to manipulate your mood and your level of focus towards your studies, it will certainly take you a while to be able to intrinsically understand how the proper application of time boxing will make you feel. So now that we got that out of the way, I'll basically say that my time boxing preferences at first started off between something like 7 to 10 minutes for pretty much all activities. And when using a quantifiable interval, for example, that would be like setting a goal of 40 SRS reviews and maybe 3 to 5 pages of a book or something. But over time, I quickly found that I much preferred smaller intervals for SRS flashcard study. Sometimes with intervals as short as 30 seconds, but normally between a minute or two. And when using quantifiable intervals, what I like to do was set an extremely low target. Maybe something like 3 to 5 cards and then watch a show for 1 minute. That applies to both goal leisure time boxing and goal time boxing, meaning that sometimes the show I would watch would not even be in my target language. Or I might do 3 to 5 cards and then read a paragraph in a book. Or do 3 and 5 cards and play a single turn of a game like Civilization. Or play through a few months in-game time in a game like Crusader Kings, or another of the Paradox interactive grand strategy games, which I really enjoy. Now, these sorts of really short intervals mostly apply to SRS study because I found that they were overwhelmingly better for me, as I personally tend to front load a lot of flashcard study when I study a new language, which I don't recommend you do unless you also like that and are pretty disciplined. But using this sort of approach allowed me to complete a large number of reviews pretty much every single day consistently. However, when doing immersion itself, I tend to keep to a time interval of something like 5 minutes or 2 or 3 pages in a book when reading. But when I'm still new in a language and am immersing at a high level of attention, then I still tend to use shorter time intervals, for example, of 2 or 3 minutes of in-show time, which of course would be substantially longer in real life when accounting for lookups or card creation time. Lastly, I just want to say that I also tend to not equally distribute my time between activities. As I tire, for example, I may do a leisure activity for 7 minutes and then only immerse for 5 minutes. My preferences when it comes to time boxing may certainly not agree with your own preferences though. I do have a friend who prefers intervals between 10 and 15 minutes and who always keeps the same interval for both activities. So just keep in mind that your preferences may definitely differ to my own. I actually have a good idea for a comprehensive time boxing add-on for Anki, and I'm definitely going to be adding time boxing features by default to the SRS that I'm developing, as well as to the Immerse with Migaku browser extension. And when I do that, I do plan to add some default time boxing intervals which beginners can utilize until they're in a place where they can better understand where their interval preferences are. So if you would be interested in a time boxing add-on for Anki, on top of the time boxing functionality that I already plan to put into the Migaku SRS and into the Immerse with Migaku browser extension, then please let me know that in the comments below, because I genuinely haven't decided yet whether I'll be making that add-on because I don't know how many people are interested in it. Well guys, that's it for today. I really hope that timeboxing can alleviate some of the pressure of a long-term goal like language learning for you, as it has done for me. If you end up trying timeboxing out, I genuinely want to know how it goes for you, so either just let me know on Twitter or even in the comment section below after you've tried it out for a while. Well anyways guys, if you're interested in helping us decide the direction of Migaku or joining our official Migaku Discord community and gaining access to early releases of Migaku software projects and other bonus content, then please consider supporting Migaku on Patreon. As always, thank you so much to all my patrons. I literally couldn't do it without your support. And of course, a shout out to the $1 Leech tier. Their courage and bravery are a wonder to behold. It is truly an honor, Leeches. If you need support with an issue you're having or are interested in joining the Immerse with Migaku Reddit community, you can find those links in the description below. If you would like a chance to win free special VIP access to the official Migaku Discord community and Migaku software projects, then please subscribe and leave a like and comment on this video. At the end of every month, I choose 15 people to get a free behind the scenes look at the community we're building, and that number will be increasing as new Patreon milestones are reached. As always, thank you so much for watching, and I hope you found some value in today's video. See ya!